Sorry. Take two. I'm calling the Finance and Administration Committee meeting to order, and I'd like to ask if there are any public comments on non-agenda matters.
Yes, there is one, Phil Sauter.
Good morning. I couldn't make the last meeting, but I did get a chance to listen to the recording with its focus on possible delay of the AMI rollout. I do hope that IT bandwidth and priorities will get sorted out so the AMI rollout, with its potential for measurable potable water savings within a reasonable financial investment, could be expedited even a little bit. It also occurred to me that we may not be as far behind as it seemed from last month's discussion. First of all, it's my understanding that nearly half of our heaviest water users already have AMI installed. And if our earlier analyses are predictive, that significant cohort of users should currently be realizing measurable water savings, maybe a couple 100,000 gallons a day. And second, we have the two adjacent neighborhoods in Corte Madera where 200 users have AMI and 200 don't. As we wait for additional AMI installations to roll out, I wonder if we could start mining data from those groups to help optimize future installations. For example, among our current super users, do we see any differences in water usage between those who have AMI and those who don't? Do these differences show up year-round or only during summer months when outdoor use is at its highest? Are there some super users who have made significant cuts in their water use and some super users who haven't changed their habits at all? Is there perhaps a difference in how often these groups access the portal? It seems that we already have useful data that may allow us to get more mileage out of the AMI installations we already have, perhaps by reaching out to customers who aren't using their AMI information effectively. Or it may inspire us to bring in more resources to help speed up targeted rollouts. I know this kind of analysis takes time away from already stretched human resources, and I'm wondering if this might be an opportunity to make some of the data available for AI analysis. It may be that nothing but hallucinations come back, and a few hours were wasted loading the data into the AI system. On the other hand, some insights may emerge that tell us there's more opportunity than we thought for getting better results for the investment we've already made. Or by expanding AMI just a little more broadly among the right 5% of customers. 2 hours with an AI consultant may be worth it. I'm sure this idea is a long shot, but I figured it couldn't hurt to ask. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments on non-agenda items, Terry?
There are none.
Okay.
I just have one.
Yeah, go ahead, Jed.
Just a quick follow-up on the last meeting when Vicky did the report out on the staffing and personnel, et cetera. I wanted to clarify one of the points that I was hoping would come back to whenever she presents here again. But what I'm looking for is kind of trend data. So how many retirees over time, FTEs over time, absences, refills, et cetera. So just looking at that, not just as a snapshot, which I think we've done before. And I just want to clarify that. That's all. That'd be helpful. Thanks.
Great. So we'll move on to the minutes. And do you have any corrections to the minutes as posted? Okay.
So, motion we approve.
Okay. Is there any public comments on the minutes?
There are none.
Okay. So those will be accepted as submitted, and then we'll move on to the monthly financial update.
Good morning, Chair Meyer and Vice Chair Smith. My name is Brett Uppendahl, Finance Director. This is our first item of the day, is our monthly financial update. I'll kind of go through its relatively routine report. As you probably remember, we are now exactly 75% of the fiscal year, so 9 months have passed out of the 12. A lot of these trends are really remaining pretty steady, and so I won't spend a lot of time on them unless you have any questions in any of the particular line items. But this last month was really kind of one of the last slow months for us in terms of, not a lot changes in March. Again, this will be March activity on expenditures, and then I'll remind you there's a 2-month lag on the water sales here that we'll get into in just a minute. But overall revenues are still trending at that overall kind of 5% below, kind of the linear rate in terms of water revenues. and that indicates we're even a little farther behind in terms of year-end projections. We've talked about that a few times the last couple meetings. You can see that top line there, 75% last year in the gray in the top right farthest box. That's where we were last year, so we were pretty well on track. This year we're a tick behind that, 5 to 10%, depending on how we're looking at it. So not a lot of change this month in the bottom line numbers. Everything really just kind of clicked along as it has been the last few months. I do have some good news for you at the end of this slideshow in terms of good trends that we saw in March, but it wasn't a lot in terms of overall numbers to change the direction. Expenditures here. Again, these have been tracking very similar to the prior year. Personnel services right at that 70% mark. So we're looking for a vacancy savings rate very similar to last year. I know Vice Chair Smith, you just mentioned kind of the look we're doing on our vacancies and our recruitment efforts and some of the retention and turnover. So that'll be kind of informative as to why we're continuing to be at this around 5% or so savings, 5 to 10% in savings and vacancies. Maintenance operations, the number there looks a little higher than prior years, 68% of budget, and a lot of that's because of the one-time payment to Sonoma this year. So that kind of juiced the numbers up early in the year, and we've been kind of steadily returning back towards normal in terms of the run rate. The rest of those two on the operating side, financing costs and capital allocation, those are set by us. Those are kind of more accrual based month by month. So those are expected to be right where they are. The capital allocation, we're a little behind on right now, but I think we'll catch up to that in terms of our labor cost distribution over the next month and a half. Capital encumbrances, capital expenses with encumbrances there at the bottom line. We're doing a good job there. That's again, still good work by our capital team. We're ahead of where we were last year. You can really see the actuals, especially the actuals. If you look at last year's actuals through March, was only 28 million. This year, we've almost doubled that. So again, kudos to the capital team. A lot of those big projects we started a year and a half ago are now coming through. And so that's all good news in terms of the overall investment level back into district's assets. So a good news story there. I think the board should remember this, and the public as well, as many of these projects we budget in the current fiscal year. It'll take more than a year to complete them, so we will always have this kind of lagging carry forward. In terms of the budget, we call it the annual carry forward. So if you don't finish a capital project in 1 year, which is highly likely, the money will roll over into the next year. So in later items today, you'll hear me talking about our capital budget, and you'll hear me talking about it in the 60 million range. What you see here is our capital expenses. The budget in this line is 86 million, and that's because we have our 60 million for this year, plus we have some prior year carry forward that came into that for old projects. So you'll start to see that. I just wanted to kind of foreshadow that before we get into later items. Water sales here as they come up. There we go. So this is my good news slide, the first good news slide in quite a few months. I think your eyes can probably quickly go down to that March number and see the 120%. It's been a while since we've been over the monthly budget there. So that was a pleasant surprise where we're, I know that's 1 month and it's one of our smallest months. In fact, it is the smallest month that we have. If you look at the overall budget for water sales, March is the low of the lows in terms of overall consumption. And that makes sense, I think, to most of us, especially if you consider the 2-month lag, and that's the water bills, the water usage during January and February, primarily. And so that's good news on the lowest overall month, but we'll take it. I think whenever we can, in terms of the financial perspective, we'll take a good bumper month there. In terms of order of magnitude, though, it doesn't really move the bottom line number. So if you see the very bottom kind of percent of expected actuals on water sales, and it's a little bit smaller at the bottom, but 90% of expected actuals, that's another way of saying we're about 10% behind where we'd want to be this point of the year. That's been holding pretty true. I think we were hovering towards 12% and 13% in the dead of winter, and we've started to come back a little bit there. So the next 3 months will really be the most formative months in terms of how our finances end. You can see there the April month that we're currently in is expected to be the beginnings of kind of the summer shoulder season or the spring shoulder season. I think we can probably all look around and know that we've received quite a bit of rain this month, so I'm not expecting another 120%. But it is kind of the beginnings of that shoulder season with April and May. And so we're looking into some of those behavior patterns and some of those kind of correlations we can in these, especially the fall and spring, in terms of how that relates to our forecasting in the future and for rate setting going forward, and just for kind of generally understanding customer behavior. So anyway, more information to come there in terms of what that means for overall consumption. And I'll just kind of leave it at, we're happy to have a good March, and we'll look at, April and largely May and June, and we'll kind of really round out how we expect to end the year in terms of overall revenue. The other ones on here are either fixed fees, so we're expect to get, really, really close to within 100% on each of those. And then the watershed fee itself will kind of always generally track with the water sales. There'll be a little bit less of a floor and a little bit, less of a ceiling because watershed doesn't have tiers to it. But you can kind of see that the 113% for watershed kind of tracks pretty well with 120% for water sales. You'll see the same thing. Whoa, this formatting is a little bit off here, so I won't spend a lot of time on this slide. I'm not sure why it's cut off there on the side. But what that's saying is, we are still below our 10-year average, and I have a better slide here. Hopefully this one shows up better that explains that. There we go. Good. So this slide is a new slide. I haven't used this one in quite a while. But I thought it'd be informative for the board and for the public to kind of see what we're dealing with in terms of long-term trends, in terms of water use and monthly water demand. I'll go back one side of this oversized, hard to see slide. This one we've been showing every month, and this one shows you the cumulative water sales up to the month that we're at. So it's always kind of this growing number. It ends off being the annual use. This one is a new slide that I put together this month, and then what it does is it takes kind of 2-year averages for different time periods. So it kind of works pretty well for trends where the dark blue there is 2020 and 2021. That was kind of the COVID years. That was, higher use overall. That was really some of the highest use we've had here at the district in recent times. 22 and 23 being the light blue there. That was the drought. That was cutting back significantly. So if you kind of just look with your eyes at the dark blue and light blue on the left, that's what we were kind of looking at as we prepared for the last rate cycle. This really, boom 2 years and this really kind of pull back 2 years. And that was that 20% drop in between the years. And that was really what caused a big issue for our finances. And then I added 2 more years there, 24 and 25. And so that's the gray line. That's probably closer to the long-term average, the gray bars there in terms of month by month. And you can kind of see that's, relatively the midpoint between the dark blue and light blue. So that would be kind of the baseline assumption is that that's our longer-term average, kind of from a crude and, just 2-year average standpoint. We'll obviously refine that over the next couple months with the help of a consultant and with a lot of work from Greg, who is behind us here. And then you'll see the kind of middle colored blue. I'm not sure if I know the shade of that, but the one where the arrow is, that far right blue in each month, that is this year alone. So that's a 1-year data point compared to the kind of series of 3-year averages. You can see there where I'm highlighting March was a good month. That was the first time we've kind of bucked the trend all year. We can see that the far right blue has been below the gray all year long until March. And so that's kind of showing you that we had a little bit of a tick back. In March might be an outlier. That might be kind of a one-time outlier because it is higher than anything but the 2020 and 2021 data. But still interesting, I think, to look at it this way. You certainly see the seasonality. You can see the variability in the summer months versus kind of the more kind of tighter range of the winter months. It's for what it's worth, and I think there's some data that can be gleaned in here. It's probably pretty interesting to see how high December was in 2020 and 2021. I mean, that was for all Decembers, that was a pretty big year that year. And you can see the difference in the shoulder seasons there, September, October, and you can start to see the shoulder seasons coming up here in March. And I don't have April and May, but I'll fill those in going forward just to kind of give us a little more sense of how the water is used by our customers and how that changes over time, within a range and kind of the outliers that come from that. So just more informative on this one. Finally, I'll summarize here again. The first 9 months of the fiscal year, 75% is done. We're about 7% below our budget and rate revenues. That tracks pretty well with our 6% lower water consumption, lower than last year. And we're kind of in that same, relationship to our 10-year average. So we're right in a pretty predictable range right now. And so we'll see how that finishes the year, as I mentioned, in May and June. And we'll be taking a really hard look at all this data with our consultants over the summer for rate setting. Operating capital expenditures, as I mentioned last month in the finance report, those are below budget, and those are really helping to offset a lot of the financial impact of our low water revenues. So we should end the year pretty close to break even. And I think I mentioned last month that if we have to pull back on some of our reserve contributions, that really helps kind of even things out. So we're expecting to end the year pretty close to a break even, depending on how May and June go. And that's that slight deficit there that I have in the last 2 bullets. Largely offset by expenditure savings. So unless there's any questions, that completes my report for the financial report this month.
Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Great. No, very clear. Thank you. It might be good for, I guess, Carrie or our kind of water efficiency team to report out on how we're seeing these trends in long-term demand adjustments? Does it impact our supply needs and kind of what's the value of it and what's happening and why? So obviously we see the financial impact, but thank you.
Okay. Any public comments on this item?
There are none.
Thank you for this, Brett. And we're going to move on to the mid-cycle budget update.
Okay, mid-cycle budget update. So this is a longer slide deck, but I don't have to spend a lot of time on each slide. I'm happy to stop at any point and answer any questions. We'll start going through the agenda here. It really is a lot of recap on the budget process as we start getting ready for the next cycle. So I have a couple slides here on the overall budget process here at the district, a couple summaries to get the board kind of reacquainted with the overall, levels of dollars and kind of order of magnitude here, and kind of a brief touch on the capital improvement program. Then we'll start getting into why rate revenues and reserves, how the two of those go hand in hand, and how that plays into next year planning in terms of the overall budget process. This slide, I think I included last month, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but just to orient ourselves again to the order of magnitude, our current budget is 186 million. That was a 14% overall increase compared to last year. Our operating fund was the day-to-day operations, and our debt service that has been increasing pretty steadily in the last couple of years at this 4 to 5% range. So kind of what you'd expect in terms of CPI and COLA, and especially given the inflationary impacts on the larger ticket items that we have to face, a little bit higher than just the standard CPI, but 4% increase is about what you'd expect. The capital fund is really where all the money has been, all the additional money has been going, the reinvestment and kind of the investment in longer term and bigger projects. We're at 67 million this year. That was a 36% increase over the prior year, and that follows a series of increases that we've done over the last few years. And I have another slide that shows this, and that includes all of the projects we talk about in other meetings, all of our core capital improvement projects, the pumps, pipes, tanks. It includes all of our water supply efforts, and it also includes a lot of our kind of behind the scenes vehicle and equipment replacement. The board, I'm sure, knows this. The public knows it as well, but we have a 2-year budget process here. So we did our budget last year. We set the budget for 2 straight years. We do that for a variety of reasons, but really within that, we know that we need to take a look at the budget mid-cycle to make sure we're okay for next year. So that's what we're doing today, is a mid-cycle review, just kind of a sanity check. Do we need to make any large changes? Do we need to really, kind of sharpen our pencils here? And that's something we talked about the last few months. And so that's what we did this last month here. In terms of that 2-year budget process, there's different ways of showing it, but this kind of breaks down into the kind of 6-month segments. So 4 6-month segments over the 2 years. We just completed our fall winter of the first part of the budget, the first part of the first year. So that's when we do our accounting. We talked about our audit. We had a good audit this year. We do a lot of our kind of internal financial analysis, start looking at demand. We've been talking about that in these meetings as well. Right now we're spring and summer, so we're getting ready for this mid-cycle review. We'll take a bigger look at demand analysis later in the summer once we get the entire year. And we just mentioned that in the last item as well. Start to take a look at our revenue trends that are outside of rates, as well as any expense drivers over the summer here. Has anything changed? Do we have any unanticipated needs? And then we start the rate study this time. So that the rate study won't be every budget cycle, but this time it will be. So we will begin a rate study. I believe you mentioned earlier this week that we've published an RFP to find a consultant for that. And so we'll be bringing that item back to the board for review in a few months. And we expect to really kind of hit the ground running with the rate study in late May and early June. And that'll take us through next year. In the fall and the winter, the first process in the budget is to kind of really take a look at our baseline budget. And it's just a term for what do we do day to day, regardless of any changes, right? If we don't make any changes to the budget, how does it look? Kind of just the base case scenario before we start talking about any additions or reductions. Within that, again, revenue trends, expense drivers, what's hitting our day to day kind of baseline budget. And then we'll talk about priorities for the district, if we want to add anything or if we need to take anything away or kind of move things around between departments or divisions. We'll have a district-wide prioritization process. We'll finalize revenue projections later in the winter, and then those will inform the final rate study. And then that becomes the decision point in terms of baseline revenues, any changes to those, any changes that come from the rate structure. So that'll be late winter. As we get into spring and summer, we'll kind of really ramp up our community outreach efforts in terms of rate setting. We have legally required procedures for Prop 218. We'll talk a lot about this summer as we get into what those requirements are. We'll bring an item to the board to approve the water rates. And then once we have those water rates set, then the budget follows closely behind that. So I don't have a lot of slides here on the budget workings, but once we have the water rates set, then that'll really inform the last kind of finishing touches to the budget workshop that we'll have. And then we'll bring a budget adoption as the final piece in June of a year from now. So a lot of bullet points there, but that's kind of the standard process over the 2 years. Kind of going back into some numbers. So, we're starting to look over here into the fiscal year 26-27 now. So we're, 3/4 of the way through 25-26. So we're looking into 26-27. You'll see that we're really starting to even off our kind of planned increase in expenditures. You'll note there kind of on the, right of that one.
Slide.
Yeah. There's a delay here on mine.
Yeah.
When it comes up, you'll see all these numbers I'm talking about.
Quickly
I
on
don't know
this,
what's wrong with
I think it's important for the staff to reach out to the folks who sued us last time and get ahead of it, right? Let's just see what their issues were. I think they probably wanted to go to court and they couldn't and didn't and got tossed. But let's figure out what the problems were now ahead of time, include them in our thought process and avoid that. And I think the last time we had a major lawsuit in our rate process, it cost our customers $2 million, and all of that money went to lawyers. It was just really too bad. So I think if we get ahead of it, talk to people, understand the issues, and try to incorporate them as best as we can, I'll bet we'll be able to avoid that massive pain.
So here's all the numbers I was starting to rattle off before I realized the delay was there. 26-27 budget is on the far right there. That's what we're heading into this next year. And it's the leveling off of kind of this planned 4-year ramp up. You'll see operating fund there, planned to increase by 5%. Again, that's mostly COLA based, mostly kind of inflationary factors beyond our control. The capital fund does go down next year, and what that indicates is actually not the lack of district investment or a planned slowdown. That's just kind of the grant cycle winding out. And so we had kind of a front-loaded grant cycle in the 25-26 budget. And again, those are multi-year grants, following the capital planning process, but those are not expected to come again in 26-27. So the grant funding goes away, but we're actually backfilling that, or not backfilling that, but underneath that is actually increased district investment in capital. And so much of that will carry forward, so you won't see it this way once we get into the year. But in terms of kind of a planning perspective, the grants are all recognized or at least budgeted in the first year of the 2-year cycle, and then they'll kind of wind off, and it's back to just basic district investment in the second year. Is that not coming up? It's doing that same thing it did before in terms of the internet. Slide 5. So I'll round out this slide on Terry's screen there. There we go. Contribution to reserves for balancing purposes. I think we set off the year expecting to be able to contribute $5 million a year in each year towards reserves, and that's again split evenly between water supply reserve fund and an unrestricted reserve fund. For balancing purposes, to be able to balance the budget, last time we had to shave that down a little bit in 26-27, and so that'll be something we'll have to take a look at going forward. And the way that's structured, that $3.5 million you can see there, coming down from 5, maintains the $2.5 million for water supply reserve, but it shaves down the unrestricted contribution to $1 million. So that'll be something that's kind of a lever of ours, or kind of a flexibility we have going forward in the next budget cycle, to think about, do we want to keep on building reserves, or do we want to kind of back off? I think that'll be informed by how much reserves we have to use this year, next year, based on water rate revenues. And so they'll kind of go hand in hand. And do we have to dip into them, or are we kind of refilled sufficiently? So that will be a piece of the discussion as we go forward, along with capital investment and along with any operating changes in terms of prioritization. By category at the bottom, I have some other slides on that, so I won't really dig into the by category, but it gives you a sense of where the big pieces are here. You can see basically in the 26-27 budget that our personnel services and our capital investments are nearly even at 65 million a year. And you can see our operations and maintenance is kind of steadily going along there in the 40 million range. And again, those are both the operating piece of that. The personnel and the operations are going up by the standard CPI or COLA amounts. Next slide. think it might be back on mine now. Okay. So I have just a couple of the graphs here. I won't spend a lot of time on them, but it's sometimes it's better to see things in terms of pie charts versus just numbers and bullets. So I try to include a little bit of both. This is that 27 budget kind of broken down into a pie chart. Again, kind of as I was just saying there, we have a pretty even distribution between personnel services and capital projects. Operations and maintenance being a smaller portion of that, and debt service is a very flat amount going each year. So these will not be expected to change much. I think these are pretty well set. So we can go to the next slide here, Terry. A reminder of our org chart here. So when we talk about our operating budget and all the capital projects we do, they land in one of these 5 divisions there at the bottom. So we have 254 total employees on the budget. It's spread out that way. In the bottom row, you can see between administration and engineering being right around 45 FTE each. Operations being by far the largest division we have, nearly 100 FTE. Watershed at 27 and water resources at 25. And you can see there at the top, general manager and general counsel. I would note that the general manager division includes communications and HR, as well as clerk of the board and the general manager functions. Next slide. Other way. So this is what I was talking about in terms of the overall trend. So this to me is an important slide because it shows, I think, really the district's kind of prioritization in terms of where we spend our money each year. The operating budget there in the light blue, trucks along each year. The operating increases have averaged about 5% annually over the past 5 years. So again, that's really consistent with inflation, consistent with especially with the higher inflation levels that we see for water purchases, for PG&E, and some of those larger kind of ticket items that we've had to catch up for. And so those chemicals and insurance would also be in that category of kind of larger than expected, inflationary increases that we've had to absorb in prior years. The capital down there in darker gray, that's really where the district's investments and kind of, intentional decisions towards rebuilding our capital program have come in. You could see there in in the early 20s, so fiscal year 19, 20, 21, 21, that baseline level was in the mid 20s, 22 million, 26 million range. With that last rate cycle, the board specifically directed that to increase over the 4-year period. So you can see that going from the mid 20s to the 30s and then to the high 40s, and now we're into the 60 million range. So that is a direct reflection of the investments we're putting in on the capital side. And so those have increased, if you average them over the last 10 years, that's a 12% increase. So it's really kind of a significant reinvestment back into the district. And we've talked about it on many occasions here, but those are for some of these larger scale projects, obviously water supply as well. But we are able to fully fund the core CIP plus these larger, $20 to $30 million projects over multiple years. So that's really kind of helped the capital team attack a lot of kind of deferred maintenance that was not able to be parsed out when you only had a $20 million budget and you had to just kind of keep things running in those about 10 years ago and then those budget years. So again, more context for where we're at as we're entering next year. I think at the end of the day here, this will be the jumping off point for the next budget. So it's important to understand what we have currently and how that may change in the rate cycle. So that's why I spent some extra time on these slides here. Next slide, Terry. One more way of looking at our capital budget overall is the percent of our total budget. And so this is, that the shapes will be similar to those last gray bars you saw on the prior slide. But what this is showing you of our total budget, how much we're spending on capital. So again, we were spending in the mid 20s, low 20% kind of before this current rate cycle. And with these adjustments, with the new rate structure, now we're spending more than a third of our budget on capital. So it's really getting to be a pretty healthy reinvestment rate for the district's funds. Terry. And again, to find the final slide on capital here, we really have kind of our core capital there on the top 5 line items. So our pipelines, our pump stations, our storage tanks, our treatment plants, and our watershed. And those obviously have, quite a few elements and components to them over the long term. But that really, you can start to see kind of relatively speaking, they change between the years depending on the project, but you can see, particularly in pipelines, the 8-9 million range we were in before, now we're up into the 20 million range in fiscal 26 and 27. Pump stations similar, we were getting maybe one small pump station a year at that $1 million-ish range before this rate cycle. Now we're able to really kind of accelerate that. And I think Tokoloma was one of the more recent examples. We talked about, a generational project of having to, address a well beyond its useful life pump station. That was a large pump station right at the core of our distribution system. So that was a significant gain for the capital team by funding for that. Storage tanks I would put in the same category. Those can be a wide range of complexity depending on the size and the location of the storage tank. But with the additional funding, we're able to really kind of attack the Pine Mountain or the Gibson tanks, as well as feature large tanks that we were unable to fund before. So now we're in the 10 million range for storage tanks. Treatment plants are next on the list. We have a lot of planned investments back into the treatment plants over the next couple of years. And Watershed has maintained a very steady increase. A lot of that's driven by BIFIP, and a lot of that's driven by the road and trails plans, and so those are now pretty steadily in the 6 million range, as opposed to the 2 to 3 million range they were in before. The biggest change here, I think the board would know, is water supply. Notably, it was 0 in fiscal 22 and 23, and now we're up to a little over 9 million a year going forward. So that's really what's funding ARC. That's what was funding a lot of those short, medium-term projects at the beginning, and that's really going to be the kind of core funding going forward for water supply. Not to get too far into the weeds, but this also is what when we talk about our debt funding for ARC, this essentially turns into the debt service payment. So once we kind of finalize these first couple phases with ARC, the plan would be to convert this 9 million and maybe plus into another debt issuance, and then it kind of just converts from cash funding into debt funding. So that's kind of part of the longer term strategy once we're ready and we've finalized our plans.
What else does that include in the water supply? Is that like if we need to do repairs to reservoir? Like what was it in FY 24 and 25?
So 24 and 25 was kind of the beginnings of us looking into design. It was some of those shorter term projects. If you remember the Suluhuli electrification, the Bond Canopy Phoenix connection, a lot of those kind of smaller, like really short term projects we were looking into. And so a lot of that was really still finishing design and really finishing some of the smaller term investments. Now that we've identified ARC as the priority project, now that that's what's funding the ARC design and the purchase of the additional pump stations, and it will essentially start funding the purchase of the actual materials and supplies going forward. So yeah, this is just, again, a very high level overview of the capital program, but considering it becomes a much bigger percentage of the budget, I thought it was worth highlighting a little bit of where that money is going. Okay. See. That's too far. I think we're on slide 11. So where do we go going forward here? It'll be slide 11 when it comes up. And I just went through this in the blue boxes, so I'm not going to spend time here, but kind of this is just a little bit finer breakdown of the next year. So in 2026, the current calendar year, in the next couple months, we're talking now about any revised budget projections, and we'll bring the board a couple different, looks at expense drivers and any unanticipated needs over the next couple months. I just mentioned we'll start our rate study over the summer. We'll finish our kind of financial analysis. We'll do our demand projections. We'll bring the board adjusted reserve balances and any changes we need to make on that going forward. In the late fall, we'll finish our audit. We'll finalize our rate study, and then there will be elections in November. I'm sure the board is aware. Next slide. Starting in the beginning of 2027, in January and February, we'll kind of have a new general manager, and we may have board changes. That'll be the time we're really pushing our community outreach program to talk about rates with the community and get that feedback. We'll finalize our rate proposal, and then we'll distribute Prop 218 notices once the board's decided on the final rate proposal. And then in March, April, and May, amongst many other things, we'll be conducting a public hearing on the proposed rate structure. And once that's finished, we'll be conducting budget workshops. As I mentioned, we'll be finalizing the budget there. And then June and July will be when the 2-year budget is adopted by the board, and then when the rate structure will take place in July of 2027. Reason I'm talking about rates so much is because rates are the revenue for us. So I know this is kind of a backwards way of getting to it, but this is our revenue budget kind of broken out by category. I think it goes, hopefully it's pretty clear here on these ones, and I have other slides that show it too, but our rate revenue there on the top lines, 175 million next year we're expecting in rate revenue. If you see the far right up there percentages, the rate revenue for next year is a 6% increase. So we're getting really back into that kind of normal range of rate increases. So a 6% increase overall in revenue. That's kind of really leveling off what we had ramped up for a while. So I think the intention is to stay in that general range. And if you compare the $175 million in rate revenue to the other $12 million, it pales in comparison to all the other revenues we get. Not that we don't certainly need those revenues, and they've been very helpful. Specifically, a fire flow fee really kind of maintains that core infrastructure expenditure in the fire flow capacity. Interest earnings have been a great boom for us lately, so we certainly don't fluff those off by any reason. And same with grants. I mean, grants going from anywhere from 2 million up to 9 million is huge for the district. So not that they're small revenues, they really are important pieces of the revenue picture. And as I've talked about many times in the last couple of months, they backfill in many cases some what rates don't get for us, and so they do go hand in hand. It's just the overall order of magnitude and how much effort, especially on the finance side, we look into the analysis is proportional to where the money comes in. I know there are other areas of the district that spend more time in other areas, but certainly for us, we look more at rate revenue. Next slide, Terry. Another way of showing that, the big blue piece of the Pac-Man here, that's the rate revenue. So, 93% of our overall revenue comes from rates. The rest are, generally much smaller in the 3-4% range. Terry, next slide. And then what this is a breakout of the rate revenue. So that the big Pac-Man and the one before, the 93%, if you break that out, just rate revenue, this shows, where that comes from within the rate structure. So water sales being the huge piece of that, 70%. And that was a big change in the new rate structure too, having a much bigger portion come from the water sales piece, which means it's more variable, which means it's more sensitive and volatile. So we're seeing the effects of that for the first time through, and that may be something we explore in the next rate process. Is that the right kind of relative ratio of fixed fees and kind of volatile tiers versus kind of more straight line revenues? So that's something we'll kind of really dig into in terms of the structure of our rates and what makes the most sense for our customers, what makes the most sense for the district, and how do we at least recognize those risks and kind of pair that with other strategies if we do have that volatility, that risk. But rate revenues are 70%. I mean, water sales are 70% of the rate revenues. The two fixed fees are the top right up there, so the orange and the gray, service charge and capital maintenance fee. Those provide that core funding we can count on each year. And then the watershed management fee is again a variable revenue, but much more kind of straight lined. And so those are all things we'll be looking at with our consultants, and certainly I'm sure we'll be talking more about kind of some of the the legal landscape navigations that we'll have to make sure we're complying with, and making sure that our customers are aware of those rate structures that we're proposing and why we either need to do those legally or why we're choosing to do those from a policy level. So that will be the discussion, starting in about a month going forward. Next slide, Terry. I have this slide here. I just wanted to kind of, we haven't talked about this since I think November or so. This is our reserves. And so to me, this is a very important piece of it. We just talked about the rate revenues and where all that comes from. We talked about how we're going to end the year. Are we going to have enough money to make it through the year? Do we need to, pull back on expenses? I think it's always good to remember we do have this here too as kind of an underlying, backstop for our reserves. And so, we have 7, 8 different reserve buckets here. The top 2 are kind of more, required and mandatory in terms of, just to kind of get through what we need for insurance and workers' comp. Capital, operating, and rate stabilization are really kind of the big pieces of how we, plan long term to withstand any changes in, unanticipated needs or any rate fluctuations, weather fluctuations, whatever it may be. The board spent a lot of time on this 2 years ago, kind of refining the targets, refining the purposes for these. And so I think, when I look at these as sources for not stopping the district's business, being able to kind of weather the storm in a planned and kind of prudent and methodical manner. In particular, you can kind of look there, our operating reserve right in the middle there, the white operating. We're right at our 3-month target. We're at 27 million, or at our target amount for 3 months of expense. So that is a source we can consider using going forward. I'd remind the board that rate stabilization there, the next one below operating, we set that to be somewhere between 10 and 20% of our variable sales. We're right at that threshold right now. We're right about 10% low on our variable sales. So if we had to pull that trigger and use that source, we could. I think that's within the board's policy and within the board's kind of intent. I don't know that we need to. That's what we're still kind of looking into. I don't want to kind of get ahead of ourselves and talk about, pulling from reserves yet. I think Vice Chair Smith has mentioned that a few times. We want to kind of tighten our belt a little bit, make sure we can do what we can before before we dip into reserves. I just want to remind the board of, what other options we do have if we want to keep on going full speed on some initiatives and use our reserves, prudently and wisely. Water supply projects as well. That was, a planned build up towards 10 million. 2.5 per year for 4 years. So, as of the last year, the target was 5 million. The amount was 5 million. We expect to get to 10 million by the end of next year. So we should have a $10 million bucket there in terms of water supply projects. We don't talk about the pension stabilization one very often because we haven't had to lately. The market has been good. We haven't seen huge fluctuations from CalPERS. So that's just going to sit there until things change. Despite all the stuff that goes on in the news and around the world, the stock market is still chugging along, and CalPERS is giving us good news, and so is our the retiree liabilities. So, kind of like probably just jinxed us right there, but I'll knock on wood for that. And you say that we're not expecting any major changes in the next couple of years, and a lot of these are lagging factors in the sense that if we do get changes, they'll be 2 to 3 years out, and we'll have time to adjust. And then I would also say that the facility fund was added by the board this year. So we have not yet deposited any money in that, but that'll be something we talk about at the end of the year is should we start kind of putting some money aside for future facility improvements. The feedback that we're getting from most of the board is yes, we need to do that. And so we'll talk about, where to pull that from, where to put that to, where the flexibilities are. But I would just, generally say that these are there for discussion. They're there for, strategic use. The overall current balance, if you kind of skim your eyes all the way to the right and all the way down, we have, just about $67 million in reserves right now for board, in the board categories. That is right back at kind of the peak point, or that's a refilled kind of buckets of reserves. So depending, again, how the year ends and how we get into next rate cycle, we can kind of adjust whether we need to add to those, create more, use them strategically. We'll have those discussions with the board and with our consultants and with the management team. So just want to kind of make the board aware of the different levers that are there and the different abilities we have to withstand, especially the next couple months, but as we get into next year, get into the next rate cycle.
Maybe just while you still have the slide up, because I know we have, I think, 5 categories that we contribute to reserves. Can you just talk through how they map to this? Right, because we have capital, we have water supply.
I mean, these are the categories. So we had less categories.
Right.
I guess probably what you're referring to is we talk about probably from the 3rd category down most often because insurance is kind of we set that and we make sure we have money for insurance. We don't really talk about that.
That's part of
we have to
operating plan. Yeah.
Yeah. Workers' comp, same thing. We get an actual report every year based on our experience over years, and we set that to be fiscally prudent. It's more important for kind of bond ratings and for our year-end financials to show that we have money set aside for these things because those can be big expenses when they come, and you don't want to have to mess with operations or capital when you have issues with insurance or workers' comp. So we don't talk about those a lot, but they're there. It's the next 5 coming down there: capital, operating, rate stabilization. Those are the 3 core in my mind, kind of operating levers that we have. Capital is there to be used. I mean, there's purposes that we have for these, and we do have a whole policy related to these. I mean, capital is there to be used for if a capital project needs more money, if we need to do, kind of a pilot investment somewhere, if we need to do grant matching, if we get a project that comes up we didn't even know about, because we have a 2-year budget, things happen throughout the 2 years. So we're typically pretty flexible moving things around. But if we were just saying, hey, we need to keep all this stuff going and use a little bit of reserves, that's where that would come from.
I guess I think where I'm going is we have kind of a budgeted contribution to reserves for each of those categories, and I feel like we filled them up a little bit sooner than we had expected, but maybe I'm wrong, but maybe it's just on target. And so possibly thinking about how we reduce that contribution, especially for the ones that are already filled up, as opposed to drawing them down, would be a way to access more budget dollars.
I see what you're saying now. And yes, that's exactly right. We did have a contribution strategy towards these. However, the stated contribution strategy was 2.5 towards unrestricted and 2.5 towards water supply. Right. And so the unrestricted, as you're saying, operating there right in the middle, that's full. So we don't need to keep dropping into that.
And so we don't have that budgeted for the future, or I guess.
What's in the current budget now, and that's what I'm talking about. We can pull that back to make this year balance. It's in next year at a 1 million level, and that's something we can pull back as well if we don't need to. So there's nothing wrong with going ahead of it here and saying we'll do a little bit more, but we just don't need to kind of sacrifice anything else or have additional rate revenues to support that going forward if we can maintain this. So we won't know that we can maintain it until the end of the fiscal year, but likely it'll be still in this range of doesn't need to be a line item anymore type of a thing. So I think you're exactly right in that statement. So this is my last slides here. Just, there's always uncertainties. We never know exactly what we're facing, especially in a 2-year cycle. So as we get into the next year, there's less uncertainties in the 1-year kind of horizon. Obviously, water use and consumption is dependent on weather patterns, so we have to keep our eye on that. Interest rates can change quickly, as I think, we've all seen in the last 10 years or so. They've maintained a pretty healthy rate in terms of our investment income this last year and a half, which has been great. Those can change though, and so we are aware of that, and those can change quickly when they do change. And then unanticipated repairs or capital projects, those happen as well, and so those can hit into reserves. But it's a much smaller list of uncertainties for this next 1-year window. As we get into the next 2-year budget, which will start again at the fiscal year 27-28, so starting in July of 2027. Then we have a lot more kind of complex uncertainties. The longer term water use projections will go into our rate study. Personnel costs, particularly healthcare and pensions, start to kind of show their face and show their effects in the longer term there, especially if there is any stock market hiccups. We've already been seeing quite a bit of healthcare inflation, and I'm sure everyone has in their personal life too, but that's one of those kind of larger kind of double-digit numbers we have to deal with as well, as opposed to the single-digit CPI numbers you see in the headlines. Regulatory changes, whether that's on the rate setting world in terms of the legal environment, whether that's long-term planning, whether that's our environmental requirements, whether that's CEQA, a lot of different changes can happen there that are costly to the district, and so those need to be planned for as we get into the budget cycle. Overall inflation in terms of what we're seeing for the cost of purchasing our pipes, for the cost of labor, for the cost of contracts, and for what we get from Sonoma, our purchased water contracts. Those can be certainly big impacts over the 2 to 4-year planning horizon. And then interest rates overall. So I know right now we focus mostly on interest rates in terms of our investment income, but as I mentioned, we'll be probably going out for a bond issuance in the next 2-year window. And so how that affects, whether we want those to come down at that point so we get cheaper financing. So we kind of are playing both sides of that a little bit, and we're hoping that we can kind of play that well in the sense of take advantage of high rates while we have money in the bank, and then take advantage of low rates while we need to borrow. That would be ideal. Obviously beyond our control, but that's why it's an uncertainty category. So I believe that wraps it up for me. Recapping next steps, I won't spend a lot of time on that, but in terms of recapping next steps, one more slide, Terry. The overall budget I mentioned a few times is starting to even off a little bit, 5% next year in terms of overall operating budget. Our revenues are provided by rates, and so rates are going to be a big focus going forward. Customer demand, and then the overall rate study that we'll be conducting. I don't think there's any major changes needed to next year's budget, so I don't anticipate bringing any items back to the board for any significant changes. I think that if there is, we'll obviously come back and let you know, but I don't think there's a need for any major changes in next year's budget that we can't manage. I think between reserves and expenditure savings, we should be able to kind of offset any kind of short-term demand fluctuations. And then again, longer term demand will be addressed in the rate study. So that concludes my report for today.
Director Smith, any more
Yeah.
questions?
Just 2 high-level comments. It'd be good to look at our kind of longer-term CIP. I don't know if you have a 10 or 20-year forecast, but we did a major catch-up, obviously, in the last few years, and so, but that we're not going to. Do not expect us to be at that 34% level of our total budget spent on capital projects for the next 10 or 20 years. I feel like this is a bump, and that there'll probably be a steady. We'll steady it if you look in the long-term trend. But I'm not sure. Right? I don't know. We haven't fixed everything, but we've definitely caught up on some really important projects that have been put off for a long time. So understanding that kind of, how that CIP might go down as a percentage over time would be my hunch, or not. Let's look at that long-term trend. And somewhat related, and this is super high level, so it would come down to really the details of where you look at pulling back. I would lean towards pulling back a little bit more on the capital projects or capital budget than the operating budget as we think forward about how to run the agency. We got to have the right people in place. We need to compensate them appropriately. And so I would lean towards maybe putting some of them off and run this place as well as we possibly can, rather than pulling down reserves, which are really important. So try to have the discipline going forward, beyond me being here, but try to have the discipline to run the place well and keep those reserves as long as possible. There are political trends not to raise rates. There's all sorts of other factors that come in. So just kind of keep it as tight as you can. That'd be my high level forecasting thought.
That's it.
Have any public comment on this item?
There are none.
Okay, I think that's everything, Brett. Thank you very much. And the next Finance and Administration Committee meeting is scheduled for Thursday, May 28th, 2026. Anything from you two? No, we're all good. Okay. We're adjourned.